Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining in for this webinar that we titled Western Alienation, Quebec Sovereignty, and the Future of Canadian Unity. I am Charles Breton, the Executive Director of the Centre of Excellence on the Canadian Federation at the Institute for Research on Public Policy, the IRPP. I'm here in Montreal, Quebec, where the results of the last federal election could not have been more different than they were, where my two guests are joining us from. So I'll start with Loleen Berdahl, who's Professor of Political Studies at the University of Saskatchewan and the Executive Director of the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. Hi, Loleen. Thanks for being here.
Hello.
And Jared Wesley, who's Professor of Political Science at the University of Alberta. He also leads the Common Ground Initiative, which I'm sure he'll talk a little about in his answers, joining us from Alberta. Thanks, Jared, for being here.
Morning.
We're gonna, jump right in. I have a few questions where we're gonna try to compare, contrast the state of these autonomous or separatist movements in our respective provinces, and then we'll open up the floor for questions from the large audience that is joining us. So please use the Q&A function for that in your window. If you have questions for us, we'll get to them. Maybe not all of them, but we'll keep some time to answer those questions. So, Loleen and Jared, I want to start with the people at the top, the main characters. We'll talk about more generally what's going on in both of your provinces and in mine. But before we go there, I really want to talk about the premiers. And I want to preface my first question by noting that among our three provinces, the provinces that we represent, if you want, the only premier who's clearly rejecting a referendum on sovereignty is mine here in Quebec. Smith and Moore not necessarily leading the charge, although, I mean, for Smith, we can get to that in a second. But they're also definitely not discouraging it. So how would you contrast or how would you describe the reaction of your premier to this new government? And we've heard a lot about Danielle Smith, so I'm going to start with Loleen and see in Saskatchewan how the Mo government has reacted. How would you describe their reaction to the result of the election?
Well, I think it's a bit different than Alberta's in intensity, if nothing else. So I think Premier Mo has been fairly cautious in terms of how he's approaching the new federal government. I mean, he said things like there's a path to work forward, and we're hoping to work alongside. So some positive messaging, and at the same time, sort of an indication that that there is a desire for some change. And so, just to quote him directly, the government of Saskatchewan is not interested in separation, and the government of Saskatchewan certainly isn't interested in the status quo. And so there's sort of a definitely not the messaging that we're seeing out of Alberta, and at the same time some clear messaging that there's an expectation or a desire for some kind of change.
I mean, I'll get to Jared. I think that's similar in a way to how Premier Legault has reacted here, though I would say there's more cautious optimism here than perhaps in even in Saskatchewan. So Jared, I was listening to Premier Smith, as many were, during her address on Monday. And I was thinking about this expression of the West wants in, and I was trying to figure out, like, does Danielle Smith want in or out of the Federation? Or I guess the real answer is it's complicated. So how would you describe her reaction?
Yeah, it's complicated. That's a good way to put it, I think. It's really tough to tell without being in Danielle Smith's head. But unlike other premiers, it's also difficult to get inside her inner circle. So I think this is one of the differences between Mo and Smith that people miss, is that while Mo is still surrounded by folks we might call establishment conservatives and that have a long history in that province and its politics, Danielle Smith has deliberately surrounded herself with people who would call themselves mavericks, that are part of what political scientists call the populist movement, folks who have been deliberately marginalized from establishment politics in this province for a long time, have been told in the past in their careers to take the back seat, and now they're in power, and they've really created a tight circle that many folks that are in the broader small c conservative movement have a difficult time penetrating, let alone understanding. So, we say we don't know what is Smith's ground game or end game. That's why, is because they do keep their cards really, really close to their chests. I think, Smith in her comments is trying to straddle the line between being a full-throated federalist. She's talked about being part of a strong Team Canada as long as Canada's on Team Alberta, for example, right? And at the same time, she is making overtures, both explicitly and implicitly, to folks who we call separatists in her base. And in a way, it's predictable that she's reaching out to Quebec and in particular the Legault government for guidance here, because that's the same needle that they've been trying to thread, right? Between the Parti Québécois and the Liberals, is to find an autonomist route forward. The big question, of course, is whether her strategy is actually going to succeed in getting there versus, tipping one way in particular, and that's towards the separatists. So we'll talk a little bit about her legislation later on in Bill 54 and how it makes it easier for separatists to launch a province-wide vote on the issue. But it's unclear whether she actually thinks that vote will happen, or if it does, what the outcome will be. And again, cards close to the chest, it's tough to tell.
Loleen, do you agree with Jared's depiction of the difference between like how the Mo government has been, operating compared perhaps to how the Smith government has been operating? I mean, we've seen even like the differences between the two when all those negotiations with Trump were going, and like Mo really, sticking closer to the rest of the premiers and even the prime minister at the moment that maybe Daniel Smith was. So do you go in the same direction as Jared in terms of how the province operates at the very top, I guess?
Yeah, I think so, and I think one thing that's interesting as well is that for the Mo government, they're being presented right now with a bit of a challenge from the NDP opposition to try to get off the fence a little bit and to not walk the line as closely as they have been. So the leader of the NDP is Carla Beck, and sometime today her party is reported to be introducing the Keep Saskatchewan in Canada amendment to the province's referendum and plebiscite act. And so, that these kind of things sort of really are pushing the Saskatchewan party perhaps a bit more. I'd be curious to hear Jared's thoughts on the extent to which the Alberta NDP is sort of holding the Smith government to account. But like sort of wanting to say, take a stronger position. Mo's been kind of positioning it in terms of, oh, well, they're trying to take away the voice of Saskatchewan, and I'm not going to condemn somebody for having an opinion. So he's sort of still trying to walk in a very careful space that I think Smith is a little more bold in some of these areas.
I mean, I want to get to this, like you talked about the NDP and in both provinces, but just generally the population. I mean, so the federal electoral map, like we all know as political scientists, that like when you look at those map of electoral results, they look like monolithic, but they're not, right? So the Liberal didn't get many seats in those provinces, but they're federal Liberal. They're also not fringe. So how would you describe like the overall state? And we're going to really generalize here, and that as issues in itself, but like, how would you describe the overall state of the public opinion in your province when it comes to its place in the federation? Like outside of just like political electoral dynamics, just the general feeling of how my province belongs to this country, like its place in the country. How would you characterize it in Alberta and Saskatchewan? So Jared, I'd start with you. And again, I know that I'm asking you to generalize, but to just give like a picture that's perhaps not as monolithic as the electoral map would suggest at a distance.
Yeah, I think before we get there, it's important to note the role that public opinion actually plays in Alberta politics these days, because it is more complicated again. And it's largely because Danielle Smith, in her own words, has said that she doesn't want to build a province-wide coalition. She's taking a page literally out of Tom Flanagan's books here and creating a minimum winning coalition in the province that means that she's really only paying attention to the voices of folks that are in her base in rural Alberta and to an extent, some folks in swing seats in Calgary. So is she paying attention to province-wide polling? Probably not. In fact, they're doing a heck of a lot less polling than previous governments. So we'll talk about public opinion that's based on the Viewpoint Alberta surveys that we've been doing since 2019 as part of the Common Ground project, but I'm not sure it matters much to Smith's direction, considering that she only has a focus on a narrow part of the Alberta electorate. The first thing to note is that Albertans are internally divided as much as they are divided amongst each other, right? And in this sense, Albertans aren't some strange species in confederation, right? Albertans are like Canadians; they have multiple identities, and they don't like being told to choose among them, right? Mm-hmm. So, in the Premier in her speech was interesting on Monday when she tried to classify Albertans into three groups. Ones that will stay with Canada no matter how badly it treats Alberta. Folks that have already written off Confederation are looking to separate, and then folks that she includes herself in this group that are copied in the middle, that want to move forward with some kind of change and aren't satisfied with the status quo. The fact is that most Albertans, when they're asked in our surveys to how strongly they attach themselves to various identities, they're likely to check strongly attached to both Canada and Alberta. This isn't a dual identity the way that we do see in Quebec polling. And really, Quebec's the outlier when it comes to those types of questions, right? Mm-hmm. When it comes to the question about whether Alberta should leave Confederation, and you can understand there's different wording that is now developed. Like, are we talking about setting up an independent country? Are we talking about being annexed by the states, becoming the 51st state by choice, and that kind of thing? But in general, over the last 5 years, the polls have been fairly consistent, anywhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 Albertans will answer yes to that question, that Alberta should leave Canada in any given poll. And that a lot of people dismiss that and say that's not a lot. It's not even close to half if we were to have a province-wide referendum. I would just remind folks that a 20-point swing in public opinion is not uncommon. We just saw it in the federal election in a matter of a couple of months, so just be wary of that. The folks that do answer yes to that question tend to be from rural areas. They tend to be older. They tend to be white. They tend to be male. They tend to side with the oil and gas industry. They tend to be populist. And that matches what we see in terms of folks showing up to separatist rallies. So our Common Ground team was at a separatist rally here just last weekend in the Alberta legislature, and that paints a picture of the vast majority of people that are there. But what's interesting, if you start to unpack that question beyond the yes or no, do you want to leave Canada or stay? Even folks that say they want to leave offer some interesting follow-up answers, right? So we ask them, how likely do you think separatism is to happen? And only 10% of that 30% will say it's actually going to happen, right? Another question, how attached do you feel to Canada? 2/3 of separatists in Alberta feel at least somewhat attached to Canada. And by putting these little pieces together, we realize that these are disgruntled folks, right? Mm-hmm. That are not saying blowing off steam, but they're expressing frustration to pollsters in a fairly low stakes way, right? Yeah. If they don't think it's possible, it's going to lead to anything, then I'm going to express it to a pollster, and it's going to get me and my province leverage in discussions. And to an extent, that does align with Smith's public commentary about her strategy.
Mm-hmm. Well, in Saskatchewan, how would you describe again in the general populations again, and outside of like electoral dynamics, just like the place that Saskatchewan has in the federation, the role it plays?
I'd say there's a lot of frustration, and you see this in terms of some of the public opinion polling. You used to see it. I'm curious what happened to all the stickers and such on the trucks that explained what people wanted to do to Trudeau, how they got them off, and how long it'll be before I start seeing the Kearney ones. But like you see it in terms of random comments that people will make. And so yeah, we've got the last provincial election revealed a bit of a urban rural split. I think we can certainly see greater senses of dissatisfaction quite often in the rural areas, people who are working more closely with the resource industries. But I think there's sort of a general sense of frustration that is often expressed. And that doesn't mean that people don't feel a connection to Canada. There's a lot of Canadian flags out there, and there is that attachment. And I think to Jared's point, I think quite often when people talk about issues of separatism, or when they talk about, oh, well, maybe we should do this or do that, it's an outlet. It's like people don't know what to do with years and years and decades of sort of this ongoing sentiment of not feeling respected, or not feeling as part of Canada, or not feeling truly part of the fold, and where are they supposed to put it? And so, and there's always this look to, well, it works for Quebec to threaten to separate, so we're going to do the same. And the extent to which people really feel it versus it being an expression of a desire for greater influence, I think that's a really important point to consider. I don't think people, I think if people sat down rationally and said, okay, do we want to be, I'm going to speak just for Saskatchewan, do we want to be a landlocked province of roughly 1 million people? And how's that going to work out for us? I don't know that you'd see, if you had that survey question, how the results would result. But people are still quite frustrated.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, because I know we're going to go to the Quebec. She built a beautiful segue for you. I'm not going to interrupt it, Charles. But
that's okay.
Yeah, you talk about feelings, right? And as I say, we've been attending these rallies. We've been looking on social media to see how separatists are communicating with and trying to expand their base. And one of the several themes that we hear them using is this notion of a broken marriage, right? They talk about how, in some cases, speakers talk about how Alberta is the abused partner in a relationship, which I think is rather insensitive in many ways. But it's this notion that Alberta has been mistreated by the rest of Canada or the federal government, and that this marriage is broken down. And why would you stay in a relationship when somebody was stealing your money, when somebody was abusing you in other ways, right? And it's an interesting metaphor, because it actually does extend to a couple of other things that we're finding in our surveys, right? So I've been asked, what is the mood in Alberta? And I've said, the mood, or the feeling that cuts across the vast majority of Albertans is one of feeling jilted. So I think Albertans do feel like a jilted lover in Confederation. They feel misunderstood, underappreciated, and they feel like their love is unrequited. And that cuts across left, right, New Democrat, conservative, liberal. That's the general feeling of malaise. And what you do with that feeling, I guess, is the question. But then Corey Hogan, who's an MP, he's famous out here because he's part of a podcast called The Strategist, but he's now an MP for Calgary Confederation, a pickup for the Liberals in that province. And the Liberals did better in Alberta this election than any time since 1968. They got just about a quarter of the vote. And Corey said afterwards, he doesn't like this dichotomous thinking of asking Albertans to choose province over country, or vice versa. And he'll never put people in that position, because he said it was like being asked to choose between your mom and your dad.
Yeah.
And so this family metaphor seems to be coming up a lot in our research, and it's something that I think folks need to pay attention to.
I mean, let's talk about policy a little more. And is there any policy solution to the malaise that you're describing? And Loleen mentioned it, the Quebec example. I mean, we often hear from both Saskatchewan and Alberta, we want what Quebec has, but what does that mean policy-wise, right? Sometimes I'm not sure people really have a great understanding of what it is that Quebec has or how it got it. And from here, this is often puzzling. Like, you want more power over immigration? Well, do it, make a deal. That was done by a Liberal here, by the way. You want asymmetry when it comes to national programs like healthcare or housing? Well, hold your ground. Just negotiate on that, right? So, and that also asymmetry on those programs, that's also a federalist position here. That's seen as a solution to allow Quebec to stay in. But in the end, it does seem like that's not what the leaders who say that we want what Quebec has, that's not what they have in mind. It does feel like this is just a way of saying, Quebec gets equalization and we don't think that's right. Am I being ungenerous here? Like, are there actual ways in which federation operates? And I mean, very like in a very concrete way that would help alleviate some of those concerns, or is it just equalization and we want to be able to do whatever we want energy-wise, resource-wise? Like, is there anything else outside of those two things? Like, I know I'm being a bit ungenerous here, but I'm really curious about what is the policy solution to the malaise that you both described. Loleen, if you want to go first.
I was hoping you go to Jared first on that one. Okay.
Okay, well, I mean,
No,
whoever wants to go first.
Equalization's a big part of it, and figuring out how to deal with equalization and how to create a perception of fairness around equalization, I think is an ongoing challenge. When we look at a lot of what Quebec has, a lot of these things are even things that were back in the firewall letter for those of us who are old enough to remember that. There are areas where the provinces can choose to act, and we're seeing them start to act. So Saskatchewan's introduced a marshal service, for example. Things like that. They're creating pathways to do their own programs. So there is that sort of asymmetrical federalist option that you're mentioning. I think what's a challenge is sort of a lot of the national policies that are perceived or do impact Saskatchewan and Alberta in ways that aren't always appreciated. That there isn't a bilateral policy for it. These are national policies, and so then how can the provinces ensure that provincial interests are being considered in these national policies, and what influence can they have? And we now have a potential Saskatchewan MP who could be in cabinet. When you've got nobody to put in cabinet, who's going to speak? Yeah. Who's going to speak for the province, and how are we going to manage that? And when I think back before my lifetime, but like there were these strong provincial ministers that would really kind of do that big tent work for their provinces and allow everything to kind of stay in the party, mostly the Liberal Party. We don't really necessarily have that right now. So I don't know that there's a policy solution. I don't know that suddenly we build some pipelines and repeal a few things and everybody's happy. It just kind of perhaps moves things a little bit, because I think there's a larger sentiment that is expressed in reactions to policy, but it's not just the policy.
Mm-hmm. Jared, I think it's also likely that we might see a minister in Alberta, but outside of that, like policy-wise?
Yeah, we also have a prime minister who yesterday came out as an Albertan, and he said, "I'm an Albertan." That was odd for somebody who just won a seat in Ottawa, but okay. But no, I loved your point, Charles. Your question was, do Albertans know what Quebec has and how they got it? I'd add, and what it got them. Yeah. Because a lot of the discussion around sovereignty and separatism cost the Quebec economy a lot. And that's something that we don't talk enough about. But the Smith government is quite open, just like the Kenney government before it. They've actually used the term taking a page out of the Quebec playbook in order to kind of craft the asymmetry that we're talking about here. The fair deal style approach that Kenney took before he was ousted was very much based on the firewall letter that was written by a group of academics and others, including Stephen Harper back in the Klein days. The big difference between that initial letter in the late 90s and fair deal and now the sovereigntist agenda that Smith has got is that the firewall letter was all about what Alberta could do on its own. And I'm stealing a line here from Ken Bosenkool, who was also an author of that letter and a Harper strategist. He says now the UCP's approach to this is to ask the federal government to do things. When the initial push for autonomy is to say Alberta should assert itself with a provincial police force, a pension plan, and so on. And by the way, all of those fair deal firewall measures are massively unpopular here in Alberta. Only about 20% of Albertans support those measures. They would rather Albertans, that the Alberta government work with the federal government in other ways. They would also like to see it, to some of Loleen's earlier work, they'd like to see more federal jobs out west. That's actually the most popular policy solution to the problems that we see here. Not less Alberta in Ottawa, more Ottawa in Alberta, ironically. That's the most popular one, supported by about 3/4 of folks. But, I just fast forward to this week. I mean, the Premier's rhetoric and strategic approach of issuing what she's calling the Alberta Accord, right, with 4 demands or 4 conditions, looks a heck of a lot like, and sounds a heck of a lot like, what Bourassa issued in the lead up to the Meech Lake Accord. Mm-hmm. The key difference here is, though, that and again, they may be only reading certain pages of the Quebec playbook here, because before he got to that point, Bourassa made a point of working with folks from across the country to generate a national consensus with premiers on this issue. He didn't just drop them. He had to know that they were realistic demands that, would push the envelope, certainly, but they could actually be achieved. And that there's no indication that the Smith government has any interest in engaging with the rest of the country on these 4 demands. I have a piece that's on Substack that talks a bit about this. There are some policy outs for each of these 4 demands. The demands are really hard line, but there is some wiggle room, particularly for the Carney government to take steps to address things. Like, for instance, there's no scenario under which Alberta will receive an equalization payment. I have no idea who is advising the Smith government on this, but equalization is designed for provinces that have below average revenue generating capacities. It's an apocalyptic scenario. If Alberta ever slips below that line, it's not going to happen. However, there are other elements of fiscal federalism that can be adjusted. And Jason Kenney was moving in this direction before he was ousted. His big target was the Fiscal Stabilization Fund, which is designed to cushion the impact of resource booms and busts, right, on economies like Alberta and Saskatchewan and other oil and gas producing provinces. So there are some outs, is what I'm saying here, if the Premier is willing to take progress as a victory, and if the federal government is willing to let them save face in that way.
I mean, so one thing that we know here also in Quebec to some extent is when you make, when you say, I want to see those 4 things, you have to be prepared. What's the next step if you get 0 out of 4, right? So that's something that we'll see, I guess.
But Charles, no, but she's made it clear what will happen, and she said that she will hold a referendum in 2026.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, we've been talking about taking pages out of Quebec's book. I think one thing that Quebec is about to do, I mean, it's not official, but I think they've been working on it. And that's a page from both Alberta and Saskatchewan's book is they're going to come out, I think, with what we call here a loi cadre, but which essentially be like the Alberta Sovereignty Act and the Saskatchewan First Act. And I guess ultimately, my question here is whether this push for greater autonomy from Alberta and Saskatchewan, but I mean, from Quebec as well in the current circumstances, are they a tactical response to specific policies, or are we seeing just a rebalancing of how the federation works after a decade of what we could call an activist centralizing federal government, or is there something more profound at play, right? Like we saw the pendulum switch one way, are we just seeing it switch, to some extent the other way, or is there something more profound at play here? Loleen?
Yeah, I think we're seeing an expansion of the IGR toolkit, the Intergovernmental Relations Toolkit. And so Lisa Young and Bianca Jamal and I have a piece that's coming out later, looking specifically at the role of conflict in intergovernmental relations. And what we argue is if we see conflict as being on a continuum of IGR behaviors, there's some things that are quite subtle, mobilizing public opinion, influence, and things. At the other end of the spectrum is separation, but close to that other end is defiance. And this is something that we've seen threatened by Alberta and actually done by the province of Saskatchewan. So defiance is where the province refuses to enact federal law in its jurisdiction. And so, you know, we saw that in Saskatchewan. And to me, that's an interesting thing. That's something that we don't typically see. And so, you know, it's its own sort of assertion of space. And is that a tactic to rebalance? Possibly. Is it a reaction to sort of a failure of our IGR system to capture these things internally? I mean, and Jared's written about this, and I think very, very persuasively, we need to fix our intergovernmental relations apparatus in this country, and so that we're able to work through these things in a less confrontational way.
Mm-hmm. Jared?
Yeah, and so Rob Curry-Wood and I actually have a piece coming out soon, and
you guys have so many pieces coming out,
right?
I
we have so many co-authors that we love to work with, so we can set up. But Rob and I actually traced some of this, brinksmanship and polarization and so on to the breakdown of the brokerage party system nationally, right? And the segregation of the parties into different enclaves that really layer regionalism onto ideology and partisanship, and there don't seem to be a lot of institutions. Political parties don't play that role anymore. The House of Commons doesn't, with the neutering of MPs' role and so on. And and intergovernmental relations was kind of the last bastion for this work. But as Loleen suggests, we're not doing that anymore. And it's not as much as conservatives like to blame the Trudeau government, and the Trudeau government does deserve a lot of blame for disengaging from multilateral engagements outside of some successful work early in the COVID-19 pandemic with weekly First Ministers meetings and so on. That was a productive time. That's because they got together and they actually had rules and institutions, and they had an expectation that they'd have to see each other again. And that tends to mollify this kind of conflict. But it's not just the Trudeau government. I mean, open federalism that Harper established was the beginning of disengagement entirely, and the emergence of bilateral federalism, these deals, one between Ottawa and one between each province. And so that, to that extent, looking at the Alberta Accord is just simply a reflection of the new reality that anything that needs to get done nationally needs to be done bilaterally. And so my argument, if the Carney government is listening, is it's time to look seriously at reinvigorating multilateral institutions like First Ministers meetings, but also ministerial meetings that happen not just among premiers and prime minister, but among ministers.
I mean, again, like if I may just add, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's also, so Quebec has also been, the current government at least, has also been, again, borrowing pages from Alberta and Saskatchewan, trying to see as like what they can do unilaterally, but that's also because they felt like anything that required multilateral or bilateral was just non-starters. So we've lost, that capacity, that habit of working through those problems as a country, I guess.
We've also lost the officials.
Yeah.
So that the generation of intergovernmental relations officials, they're a bunch of weird ducks. I'll tell you, they don't tend to circulate around government all that much. They were together really throughout the patriation times, then the two constitutional accords, then the Quebec referendum. They were the same players that were in place across most provinces, and that was a real time of synergy and a time of trust ties developing between jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. Those folks have all mostly retired. And as public administrations have shifted towards moving ADMs and executive directors around to different government departments, IGR is no longer a specialty, right? Mm-hmm. And as a result, nobody really knows how to play this game really well anymore. There are some few exceptions, and I would say the government of Quebec is one of the last bastions of this work, but it's definitely not in play in the rest of the country. And the Council of the Federation itself, which was designed to do this kind of horizontal work among provinces at a time when the Harper government was disengaging, the premiers got together and said, well, let's work together then. Let's do a national energy strategy. Let's put a healthcare innovation working group together. There's no impetus, no talent, quite frankly, to do that these days. I'm not trying to disparage folks on this call, many of whom work in this space, but it's a very different time than it was when I was working there a decade ago.
I want to talk about the, I just have a few questions left. So people who have questions, please put them in the Q&A on the Zoom. We'll move to them very quickly, very soon. I wanna talk about the other two provinces in the West. Because there's Western alienation in our title, and people in BC and Manitoba always complain that like they don't feel alienated that much. But I want to talk about those two provinces. And Loleen, you've written a piece for us on Western alienation that is still one of the most read pieces that the center has published since the center started, albeit just 5 years ago, but still, it's every month. People find it. People are trying to figure out what does Western alienation means or is. They find your piece and they read it. How can we explain in a few minutes the decline, if there was ever a sentiment similar to what we see in Saskatchewan and Alberta? I mean, not exactly the same thing, but this decline in BC, Manitoba, and is there any learning here for the current situation? And maybe the answer is no, but just like historically, like now we're really focusing on your two provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, but there were times in the past where that wasn't necessarily where most of the issues were, maybe.
So I see West as a sort of constantly moving definition, and it's, you know, it's sort of almost like an accordion in some ways. It'll expand out and then it'll go in. You continually you'll have Alberta and Saskatchewan in that middle, but the extent to which it'll reach out and contract back in really depends on a few things. I think some of it is has to do with leadership and the extent to which premiers are sort of responding and how they're getting along with the federal government. Some of it can relate to ideology. I'd also be curious to see some of the numbers that, you know, we tend to look at things at the provincial aggregate.
Yep.
So if you look at BC, you're going to have this big representation of the Vancouver area and the island. They were never really that. You know, you have to dig deep to really get them into the Western alienation side. But you go into the BC interior, and quite often you can see those attitudes there. So I think some of it might be masked by some provincial numbers, and some of it possibly could relate to leadership and ideology.
Mm-hmm. Jared, do you want to talk about Manitoba a bit and where it fits in that picture?
Yeah, I'm a proud Manitoban. Go Jets, go! Playing tonight, round 2. Great. Yeah, I think though the Manitoba PCs actually went through a very divisive leadership race recently,
Yeah.
right? And between what I would call the populist wing and the more establishment wing of that party, not unlike the schisms that have happened in BC within their various conservative parties over the last half decade or so. And so to the extent that populism is carrying the day among the conservative movements in those provinces, I think you see a greater attachment to Western alienation. To the extent that establishment conservatism or that New Democrats are governing, which also is happening right now in both of those provinces, you see Western alienation decreasing. I wrote a piece called Western Alienation 2.0 not too long ago, where I talked about how the West, I agree with Loleen, the West as a concept has shifted quite a bit over the last generation, and I think we often forget that. When I was growing up, hearing about the West, if you imagined it was like this boundless frontier, and in the piece, I definitely talk about how that ignores the role of settler colonialism in the region, certainly.
Absolutely.
But the mythology of the West was always one of being boundless. And in the last generation, boundaries have started to be erected from the outside, right? No longer can we freely exploit our natural resources without having environmentalists or international markets get in the way. No longer can we take for granted that all of our communities tend to look the same, talk the same, think the same, with migration even into rural communities and the evaporation of some small towns. The West has become a place of fences and boundaries in a way that it hasn't in the past. And people that have a nostalgia for the way that things used to be tend to be more attached to the concepts of Western alienation and separatism that we're talking about.
To close for now, so one piece of advice for Prime Minister Carney, one concrete step that should be taken to address regional grievances related to your province. It doesn't have to solve everything, probably can't, but just one step in the right direction. I'll while you think about that, I'll start by talking about Quebec just a little. I said at the beginning that there was the feeling, or what we were hearing from Premier Legault was cautious optimism, and I think that's true. I think on an economic standpoint, there's a lot of similarities between how the Premier and the Prime Minister think, but I do think that the one key friction point that will happen really quickly is asylum claimants coming in from the south. And that's one point of discussion between the two governments. And we were talking just before about how the federation doesn't talk as a federation anymore. The fact that asylum claimants are coming in mostly in Quebec and Ontario, and what do we do with that as a country, I think has implication. And the previous government tried to, talk about a redistribution, if possible, of those asylum claimants across the country, and really quickly, Danielle Smith in Alberta, Tim Houston in Nova Scotia didn't want anything to do with it. So there's a discussion here as a country. How do we welcome those people? How do we pay for the services that these people are getting, mostly in Quebec and Ontario? And that will be really the first pressure point. So I would say the first piece of advice I would say in the relationship between Ottawa and Quebec is to really sit down and have an adult discussion about asylum claimants and what to do with this their number that are likely to increase again. So I don't know who wants to start.
Well, I'll take the heat off of Loleen here. She's been going first with all of these questions. I'll even actually end with a citation of her work to hand it off.
There you go.
Look, there's been a huge decline in trust among governments, let alone among peoples in across this country. And the disturbing part of the Viewpoint Alberta research that we found is that Albertans tend not to trust other Canadians to the extent that we'd like them to. But let's start with what Carney might do to cultivate trust among the leaders of this country, in particular premiers, but you could also extend this to First Nations as well. And that's, trust can be built through structure. Trust can be built through rules and institutions. So as I said before, reinvigorating First Ministers' meetings, making them routine, not ad hoc and called at the whim of the Prime Minister is one way to do it. I've also suggested that Loleen's idea of and research on joint cabinet meetings that aren't simply photo ops, but rather actually sitting down and having cabinets, the federal cabinet travel around the country and meet with provincial cabinets is another good solution. Before I throw it over to Loleen, I think just if I'm throwing a bonus tip for the Prime Minister, and I think I would try to avoid as much as I can trying to disparage and use separatism as a wedge during the upcoming by-election for Pierre Poilievre here in Alberta. Mm-hmm. I remember in the aftermath of the 2019 federal election, a group of us met here in Edmonton to talk about the rise of separatism and what the Liberal government then could do or not do to help tamp that down. And I was surprised and encouraged at the consensus that this is not something to make partisan light of. This is not something to play gotcha politics with. This is a potentially dangerous element of a threat to national unity. And so I would hope that the Liberals can resist the temptation to try to paint Poilievre into that corner. I know the media will likely do it for him, but I think it is important to provide Poilievre and other federalist conservatives an off-ramp here and to provide them with some room to do the good work of trying to tamp down separatism.
Loleen.
So I'll yes and to what Jared said. One thing that a good leader does is they set the tone. And my advice to Prime Minister Carney is to be very careful about the tone that he is setting with and about I don't want to say Western Canada, I want to say Alberta and Saskatchewan. Yeah. And one thing that is very important to these two provinces are the economic foundations, and there's a lot of pride. There's a lot of pride in the contributions that oil and gas, potash, canola, forestry, uranium, the entire agricultural sectors, that these make to the country and to the world. And so what I would like to see is the contributions of these two provinces being acknowledged and celebrated as being important to the national economy, important to our national identity. And I'd like to see them acknowledged as and celebrated as the advanced industries that they are. These are industries that are advancing innovation, they're advancing service sector. You know, like there's sort of this whole idea of you know, hewers of wood and drawers of water. You know, Harold Innis pulled that from a Bible phrase or something like that. But you know, these natural resource industries are often very cutting edge. They can be part of the future of Canada. And I'd also say, you know, when we're in the current world we're in a world where we have, you know, limited wood and water and other natural resources, these are things to be valued. And you know, so we should celebrate the fact that we are innovative world leaders in hewing wood and drawing water and doing all of these things. And then, you know, this is important to us. This is important to our future. And then how do we work with these two provinces to support these industries, to support these economies, to support, you know, how people work is a core part to people's identities. I think people will forget that. And, you know, there's a lot of pride here. I don't think it would, even though, you know, you've got the whole, you know, now the West wants out, there's still a very strong undercurrent of the West wants in.
Yeah.
Tap into that. Get the West in and celebrate that. So that would be my advice. Prime Minister Carney, if you're listening, you set the tone. So set the tone in one that says you are not just part of our team, you are important to our team. And we are so excited to work together. I would love to see that kind of tone set.
That's great. We're gonna move to questions from the audience, and I'll start with a question that I was about to ask, but wanted to leave time for our audience. So it's a question I'm asking my own question, but it's coming from the audience, I swear. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it goes in the same direction, and it in a way it touches on what Loleen, you were talking about, the economic foundation. So how do you see Western separatism movement playing out when the reasons for their alienation are mostly economic in nature, whereas in Quebec, the reasons were more cultural, linguistic, and identity-based? How does the movement motivation distinguish it from previous ones? And now how could that influence the federal government's response? And I before you answer that, I feel like we make a mistake when we see the economic component as not being an identity. Because I feel like that's very central to what's going on here, right? So whoever wants to jump in on this.
I'm going to let Jared, because I saw his head moving so rigorously.
Yes.
I was afraid he was going to hurt himself.
Yeah. So, and I'm going to build on what Loleen said earlier. So we've been doing not just surveys, but also focus groups with Albertans over the last 5 years. And we worked with hundreds of folks in hundreds of focus groups across the country, across the province. And we asked them to do a simple thing at the beginning of each activity. And we asked them to simply draw us an Albertan. And it's interesting to see just how ubiquitous the image of Joe Albert, he's often almost always called Joe, middle-aged, white, blue-collar man working either in oil and gas or a rancher or in farming, right, in agriculture in general. And you know, the ubiquity of that image within and outside of the province suggests it's a real part of the Alberta identity. It's part of the brand. It's part of the deep story that we tell ourselves about what it means to be Albertan. And if that is the mentality, even if you don't agree with what Joe does, you tend to, or Joe thinks, or Joe says, you tend to adopt that mentality. If he is downtrodden, if he feels like he's being disparaged in any way, if he feels, to draw on what Loleen just said, that his honor is being threatened, right? Which is the case for oil and gas workers, specifically over the last few decades. It's gone from being a very honorable profession, contributing to the Canadian economy, to being a huge part of the problem. I mean, we've talked with, and CBC actually interviewed a gentleman up in Fort McMurray who spent his entire day going out and looking for new jobs after he keeps getting laid off and so on. He said he's tired of coming home, flipping on the TV and finding Greta Thunberg and others blaming him for all of society's woes. Now, we can all say, oh, just get over it. But no, and it's not just Joe or the people that are in those jobs. It's a collective mentality, because oil and gas is such a part of that provincial identity. So I agree wholeheartedly with Loleen that we need to reinstill some honor and respect, quite frankly, for folks that work in this industry and folks that are in the province that support it.
Go ahead.
Can I just build on that? It's not just the people who work in the industry. I think, to Jared's point, people identify, even if they work outside the industries, these main industries. I'm going to use a plural because Saskatchewan's got a lot of resource industries going on here, but people in different jobs are working in, for example, services that support those industries, and so it's ubiquitous. And where I've always really struggled is this idea that people's economic interests, their well-being, what pays for their home and their quality of life, that I've always struggled that, first of all, that this isn't a part of identity. I think it is. I mean, you ask somebody, tell me about yourself. What the first question is, what do you do? What's your job? Who, that's how we position people in the world. But the second thing that I've always been a little, that the idea that this doesn't matter. I think it matters to people a great deal. And Jared did the same focus groups in Saskatchewan. And funny story, a little disturbing to me as a parent, was that he was looking for young women, and I was like, oh well, my daughter is now an adult. She can participate in this focus group, and I know Jared's shtick, and so I was like, okay, I can't wait to see the drawing. And she's been raised in a home with and she's always been raised in an urban environment, 2 professional parents, the whole sort of thing, and professional sort of office working parents, I should say.
Yeah.
And then I said, I want to see your drawing, and she brought it out to me. And it was a farmer in a backwards baseball hat with a piece of wheat coming out of his mouth. And I said, what is this? And she said, well, this is our province. So people identify that way. And I think to acknowledge and to say, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for all the good stuff you're doing for the country. I think, people felt pretty beaten down by a lot of the rhetoric that they heard from the Trudeau government, and it was a disjuncture from what they felt they were contributing to the country and to the world, and that doesn't sit well with people.
Okay, so next question, Jared. There's a lot of questions that are asking about what we're seeing from Danielle Smith, but from an internal Alberta perspective, whether it is strategizing to deal with some components of her own party. So the internal political dynamic within Alberta. So what part of what we're seeing here from the rest of the country is seeing is coming from this internal dynamic?
Yeah, it again, it's very tough to tell because we don't have access to her mind and her inner circle. But it seems to be equal parts, right? Internal, management of her caucus. By the way, people might have missed this. She had a cabinet minister resign, and he and another MLA have now been expelled from the party, and they're sitting on the opposition benches right now due to a scandal that the premier is enveloped in right now, with 8 different investigations into what looks like pay to play, or is being alleged as pay to play. So to an extent, a lot of this stuff might be interpreted as a distraction, right, from that deep scandal. But it could also be, her attempt to try to hold a very difficult, challenging caucus, which is made up of rural and urban folks together. So there's that. As much as it would be an outreach to the rest of Canada and the federal government. And then the other piece is how much of this is playing to the Americans, right? And I don't mean the Trump administration necessarily. It doesn't, aside from a few photo ops, meet with her, but rather oil and gas industry and investors. And in that sense, I think that's where their strategy is the most problematic. Because if they're not reading the pages of the Quebec playbook that talk about the economic impact of even talking about separatism, they're missing a very important part, because the economic consequences of investment drying up are still being felt in that province. And we're starting to see some signs of that here.
So a political science coming from a political scientist. So our colleague, Kelly Bliduk at the easternmost province in the country. And again, I think he's thinking about Quebec here in a way. So do you think that there's an avenue for a successful sovereigntist party in the province, in the Western provinces? And is a Western separatist movement even viable without one, in a way? Because that's what keeps it alive here in the province, right? There's a single party that's dedicated wholly to that.
If you ask Jason Kenney, he'd say no, and he's flat out saying it's never worked before. They only ever elected one MLA, and he was turfed soon thereafter.
Yeah.
But the broader question, I think, is where does the leadership of this movement come from?
Yeah.
And when we went to that separatist rally, this was something that people were coming to us with. We weren't asking questions about it. The participants were coming to us and saying, "Who's going to lead this thing?" Because the leadership that they have right now is very fragmented. And in the rally goers' words on their own, this isn't my words, this is what they're telling us. These folks are not fit for prime time. That was a quote. The folks that are wearing the cowboy hats and traveling down to Washington have no idea how international or domestic politics work.
Yeah.
And so there's almost a waiting for Godot feeling here. Who's going to step up and lead this? But you're right, Charles. If you're looking at the Quebec playbook, these are folks that need to be drawn from the establishment parties. This is not from the outside, right? If you look at Lévesque, came out of the Quebec Liberals. If you look at Bouchard, came out of the Progressive Conservatives. So if we're following that playbook, then somebody's got to emerge from the United Conservative Party, whether it's Danielle Smith or someone else. And we're all just kind of waiting to see whether that emerges.
And in Saskatchewan, Loleen, this is toned down. Like it's the question is not asking itself to the same extent that it is in Alberta. I guess that this is not something that we see on the horizon at all.
No, I mean, what I think is a bit of a risk in Saskatchewan, but also possibly in Alberta is more that that we end up with a bit of polarization between the two main parties, and one party is sort of, well, really the NDP in both provinces is sort of the pro-Canada party, anti-separation party, and the other party is trying to balance different interests within the bigger tent. If I could just add sort of a tangent, I guess one of the things that concerns me more on the referendum, plebiscite, direct democracy side, outside the party system, is really the potential for outside actors to be sort of wading in. And so there's what's going on in the province, but to what extent are there other entities well funded and not necessarily having any of Canada's or the province's interests in play that might be able to come in and make things very, very chaotic and very difficult. And I find that very concerning. I mean, we all just, Brexit is sort of the big warning for all of us. You just never know how things end up, and as Jared said, 20-point swings are possible. But the other thing is even if we go through these processes and things end up, everyone's votes overwhelmingly in favor of, we love Canada, we're staying here, all of that. What a tremendous amount of resources in terms of time and energy and all of these things, when both provinces have their own challenges that they need to deal with. We need to be building our economies in the face of these different tariff challenges. We need to be looking at issues of affordability. We've got the housing issues that everyone has. We have the opioid issues that everyone has. And we're spending time on this. And it's like,
I know it's funny, Loleen, like the rally goers that we spoke to, about half of them would lead with that. They'd lead with affordability issues, right? And they'd actually say, we had one single mom who's in recovery who spoke with us, and she said, yeah, I was really disappointed because Pierre Poilievre was talking to me. You talked to single moms, and I was really looking forward to solving this affordability challenge. I saw the federal government a solution. Now they're only a barrier to that. And we don't push back in our interviews, we just listen. But I felt like saying, how is any of this and the resources that we're throwing into this, and we're spending time talking about this instead of looking at some of those challenges that these folks are really facing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the reality of it is that, we haven't had a chance to get into this here, but we've already seen the pushback from the First Nations in Alberta.
Absolutely, yes.
And Saskatchewan has 6 treaty areas, or 6 main treaty areas. Alberta has 5 treaty areas. Those treaties are with the Crown. And so, the feasibility of any of it, is it even possible, much less I'm gonna write, all of these sorts of things. And this is taking a lot of energy, and we have homelessness, we have people in need, we have tariffs, we have all of these things, and it takes a lot of oxygen. as Quebec has experienced, and as Jared noted, it wasn't great for the Quebec economy for this to happen. So, you know, it's the choices that are curious.
You know, and just if folks are looking to pay attention to the separatist movement in Alberta over the next several weeks, I said that the leaders of the separatist movement are, in their followers' words, not ready for prime time. The chiefs are ready. And they have actually been, I'm not going to say who, but they've actually been engaging with folks that do this kind of, and have experience with this in Quebec. And you can expect a summer of serious campaigning on the part of First Nations leaders and possibly Métis leaders here in the province.
Yeah, because they came out like that. The letter that came out, like that was quite the reaction, and it's and you know, voices that are that need to be heard, right? Okay, one last question, and then I will let you go. And it's stuff that we've touched on here and there, but how much that feeling of malaise or alienation or whatever we call it, is it really just like a fully 100% correlated with rural urban dynamic or not? Like, is it just that we're talking about? I see there's a lot of no's there.
No. That would make it easy.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and as I said before, that feeling of being a jilted lover, if we're going to use that metaphor, you can find those folks in Calgary and Edmonton as much as you find them in Hannah and St. Paul.
Yeah.
And it's not I mean, it's easy to say, oh, it's the rural people, or it's the conservative people, or it's the uneducated people, or it's the old people, or it's this, or it's that. That's not true. You know, you might find variations in levels of intensity, but this is a larger sentiment. And I guess what I find frustrating is it's been a larger sentiment for a period of time. And yeah, it ebbs and flows, and you know, at times it flares up and at times it flares down, but it's just there. Yeah. And the fact that that we continue as a country to not do anything, and to allow our IGR systems to become ineffective, and to not sort of set a tone that is about national unity and creating a cohesive national identity. You know, like that's on the country, and that's on all of us.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the way you describe it now seems to me like it is an even makes it an even more complex issue to deal with. And we wish Prime Minister Carney the best in trying to manage all of these things now that he's dealt with one big one yesterday. I thank everyone who was in the audience. Thank you for being with us this afternoon, wherever you were. Thanks, Loleen and Jared, for being my guests here today. And I thank you.
Thanks so much.